My father once told me that it would have been perfectly fine if I had died. Not in a joking way, not out of anger in the moment. No, he calmly looked me in the eye while sitting in my own living room and told me it would have been acceptable if I had died from sepsis during my miscarriages. And while he said it, my stepmother just sat there, nodding. That was the moment I realized something terrifying. These people weren't just toxic, they were dangerous. But what I didn't realize at the time was that months later, they would go behind my back, contact the man who abused me, and try to use him to gain access to my toddler daughter. And that's when I decided something. If they wanted to play games with my life, then I would expose the one secret they thought nobody knew about, their illegal cannabis operation. And trust me, the fallout was nuclear. Before we get into this story, if you enjoy intense revenge stories where karma hits hard, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around. Because this story, it's about betrayal, family toxicity, and a revenge plan that took months to execute. And when it finally landed, let's just say the people who preached law and order suddenly had a lot of explaining to do. Growing up, my relationship with my dad was always complicated. At least that's the polite way of saying it. To the outside world, he looked like the perfect man. He was a deacon at our church. He talked constantly about morality, discipline, and family values. People admired him, respected him. But inside our home, he was someone completely different. My sister and I grew up walking on eggshells around him. His favorite weapon wasn't physical violence, it was humiliation. He loved to tear people down, especially his own daughters, and my sister suffered the worst of it. I remember one moment so vividly that it still makes my stomach turn. She was maybe 16. My dad made her stand in front of the mirror while he made her exercise, not to help her get healthy, not because he cared about her well-being. No, he made her do it so he could point at her reflection and say things like, "Look at you. See how fat you are? You should be embarrassed." Imagine being a teenage girl hearing that from your own father, over and over and over again. Eventually, my sister had enough. As an adult, she cut him out of her life completely. And honestly, I don't blame her. But the hypocrisy didn't stop there. Remember how I said my dad was a church deacon? Yeah, well, he also had another hobby, cheating on my mom. Constantly. It became such a pattern that eventually my parents divorced, and then my stepmom entered the picture. At first, she seemed calmer than him, less aggressive, more reasonable. But over time, I realized something. She wasn't better, she just enabled him. She sat quietly whenever he insulted people. She nodded along when he said cruel things. She never stopped him, which made her just as responsible. Fast forward to last August. By that point, my relationship with my dad was already fragile, but I was trying, because sometimes you hope that maybe, just maybe, your parents will change, that maybe becoming a grandparent would soften him. So I invited him and my stepmom to my house. What started as a normal conversation slowly drifted into something more personal. I opened up about something incredibly painful. I told them about my second miscarriage. Both pregnancies had been silent miscarriages, which meant I had carried my babies without knowing they were already gone. And in both cases, there was a real risk of developing sepsis. I was explaining how terrifying that experience had been, how traumatic it felt, how I was still emotionally recovering. And somehow, the conversation turned into politics. Suddenly, my dad was ranting about his beliefs, and then he said something that made the room go silent. He looked directly at me and said, "You know, if you had died from sepsis during those miscarriages," he shrugged, "that would have been fine." My entire body went cold. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. But then he kept talking, explaining why my death would have been acceptable according to his political views. And my stepmother, she didn't defend me. She didn't interrupt. She just sat there, nodding. Something inside me snapped. I stood up and pointed to the door. Get out. My voice was shaking, but I didn't care. Get out of my house. Instead of leaving immediately, they started yelling, calling me dramatic, ungrateful. My stepmom followed me through the house, screaming insults. My dad moved slowly, deliberately packing his things like he had all the time in the world, almost like he was trying to provoke me further. Finally, I grabbed his suitcase to speed things up. That's when he lunged at me. He tried to grab the bag out of my hands, but he missed. His arm slammed into me instead. Not hard enough to leave a mark, but enough to make it clear he was willing to get physical. At that moment, I knew something with absolute certainty. These people would never change. After that night, I made a decision. They would have no contact with me, and more importantly, no contact with my toddler daughter. Because if someone can look at their own child and say they'd be fine with them dying, then they absolutely cannot be trusted around a grandchild. I sent them a clear message. Do not contact me again. Do not attempt to contact my daughter. We're done. For a while, it seemed like they might actually respect that, but I should have known better. Instead of contacting me directly, my dad tried a different approach. He started reaching out to my mom, then my sister, sending messages, trying to get information about me, trying to manipulate them into reconnecting us. But both of them knew exactly what kind of person he was, so they ignored him. That didn't stop him. My dad has always been the kind of person who believes boundaries are just obstacles to push through. And when he realized he couldn't reach me through my family, he decided to try something far worse, something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. He contacted my ex-husband. When my dad realized he couldn't reach me through my mom, and he couldn't manipulate my sister, he went looking for someone else. Someone he knew had power over me. Someone he knew could hurt me. My ex-husband. Now, to understand how disturbing this was, you need to know something. My marriage had not ended peacefully. My ex wasn't just someone I fell out of love with. He had been abusive, emotionally, manipulative, controlling. Leaving that relationship had been one of the hardest things I had ever done, and my dad knew that. He knew exactly what that man had put me through. He knew how long it took me to rebuild my life after the divorce. He knew how much therapy, strength, and support it took just to get back to a place where I felt safe again. And yet, despite all of that, my father decided the best way to get access to my toddler daughter was to go straight to the man who had abused me. At first, I had no idea. For months, everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. I thought maybe they had finally accepted the boundaries I had set. Maybe they had moved on. Maybe they had realized that pushing me further would only make things worse. But behind the scenes, they were busy. Very busy. My dad and stepmom had started communicating with my ex-husband. Messages, phone calls, Facebook conversations, all behind my back. And what they were doing was incredibly manipulative. They were trying to form an alliance with him. Their goal? To gain access to my daughter through him. Think about that for a moment. My father, the man who constantly preached about morality and family values, was secretly collaborating with the person who had abused his own daughter, all because he couldn't respect a boundary. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the calculation behind it. My dad knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that reconnecting with my ex would reopen old wounds. He knew it would cause stress, fear, anxiety. But that didn't matter to him, because in his mind, my boundaries weren't valid. My feelings weren't valid. The only thing that mattered
was getting what he wanted, and what he wanted was access to my daughter.
This went on for months. Months of messages, months of conversations, months of them trying to build trust with my ex. They tried to paint themselves as victims. They told him stories about how I was keeping their granddaughter away. They tried to make me look unreasonable, like I was overreacting, like I was the one creating drama. And unfortunately, at first, my ex entertained it. Not necessarily because he believed them, but because he liked the attention. He liked being involved. He liked knowing he still had the power to disrupt my life. Eventually, the truth came out, and when it did, it hit me like a punch to the stomach. I remember staring at my phone in disbelief, reading the messages, trying to process what I was seeing. It felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. My father, my stepmother, and my abusive ex talking about my daughter, discussing ways to stay involved in her life, all without my knowledge, all behind my back. I felt sick, not angry at first, just hollow, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I contacted my ex immediately, and I told him everything. All the things my dad and stepmom had done during our divorce, the manipulations, the lies, the attempts to interfere in my life, things I had never mentioned before because I didn't want to stir up more drama. But at that point, I didn't care anymore. He needed to understand exactly who he was dealing with. To my surprise, he seemed to get the message. He told me he would cut them off, that he didn't want to be involved in their drama. And for a moment, I thought maybe this nightmare was finally ending. But of course, it wasn't, because people like my father don't just stop. Even after my ex supposedly cut them off, they kept trying. 2 weeks before everything finally exploded, they contacted him again, through Facebook. Still pushing, still trying, still refusing to respect boundaries that had been made crystal clear. By that point, I had told them at least 10 times to leave us alone. 10 times. 10 separate warnings. And every time I told them the same thing. If you don't stop, I will explore every possible option to make you stop. But they didn't believe me. They thought I was bluffing because my dad had always believed something about me. He believed I was weak. He believed I would eventually give in. He believed he could bully and manipulate his way back into my life, just like he always had. What he didn't realize was that something inside me had changed. And honestly, their obsession wasn't just limited to me. My sister had been dealing with his harassment for over a decade. When she finally moved away from him, she thought she had escaped. But my dad is the kind of person who refuses to let go. When he discovered her house was for sale, he did something unbelievably creepy. He went onto the realtor's Instagram page, started scrolling through photos, and found one of my sister. She had just given birth. She was holding her newborn baby. It should have been a beautiful moment. Instead, my dad called me, and the first thing he said was, "Wow, she looks really fat." That was it. That was his entire takeaway. Not congratulations, not happiness for his grandchild, just cruelty. When my sister moved to her new home, she didn't tell him where she was going. She wanted peace, distance, safety. But my dad wasn't about to let something like privacy stop him. So he did what he always does. He dug. Public records, tax databases, online searches, and eventually he found her new address. Then he started sending things there. Letters, packages, messages. Just enough to remind her that he could still find her, that he could still reach her, that he was still watching. Relentless. That's the only word for it. Relentless. By that point, I was emotionally drained. Years of manipulation, years of cruelty, years of trying to maintain some kind of relationship with someone who clearly enjoyed hurting people. And now, he was involving my child, my daughter. That was the line, the absolute final line, because I can tolerate a lot when it comes to myself, but when it comes to my child, no, absolutely not.
That's when the thought first crossed my mind. Not revenge, not yet, just a way to stop them, for good. You see, my dad and stepmom had something in their lives that they thought was perfectly safe. A business, a cannabis grow facility. Now, before you assume anything, cannabis businesses can be perfectly legal, but they're also heavily regulated, especially across state lines. And my dad, he wasn't exactly the kind of person who liked following rules. In fact, there were things about their operation that had always made me uncomfortable, things I had noticed over the years, things that didn't quite add up. At first, I ignored it, because honestly, I didn't want more drama in my life. But now, after everything they had done, after months of harassment, after involving my abusive ex, after trying to manipulate their way into my daughter's life, suddenly those details started to feel a lot more important. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. They had been breaking a lot of rules, and if the right people knew about it, their entire business could be in serious trouble.
For years, my dad and stepmom had been running a cannabis grow facility. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, cannabis businesses can absolutely be legal, but the key word there is regulated. Every step of the process is monitored. Where it's grown, where it's transported, how it's sold, who handles it. The rules are strict, and if you break them, you can lose everything. Licenses, money, your entire business. And that's where things started to get interesting. Because my dad and stepmom had a habit that always made me uneasy. Their grow facility was located in another state, which meant they traveled back and forth frequently. Flights, airports, suitcases. And every time they came home, they brought their product with them. Cannabis, packed directly into their luggage. Then they'd hop on a plane and fly across state lines like it was no big deal. What made this even more surreal was the fact that my dad had always been one of those law and order people. You know the type. The kind who constantly lectures everyone else about rules. The kind who talks about morality and consequences. The kind who insists that if you break the law, you deserve whatever happens to you. But apparently, that philosophy didn't apply to him, because transporting cannabis across state lines is a massive regulatory violation, especially if you're operating under a licensed grow facility. And there was something else, something even worse. My dad held a securities license, which meant he was supposed to follow extremely strict professional standards, standards that absolutely did not include secretly transporting controlled products across the country. In other words, if the right agency found out, things could get ugly, very ugly. Now, I want to be honest here. I didn't immediately jump to revenge. That's not how it happened. For months, I wrestled with the idea. Every time the thought crossed my mind, I pushed it away, because reporting them would have serious consequences, not just for them, but for the entire business. Employees, partners, money, everything. I asked myself the same question over and over again. Am I really willing to do this? Some days the answer was no. Other days the anger came rushing back. The memory of my dad saying he'd be fine if I had died, the harassment, the stalking, the messages to my abusive ex, the attempts to manipulate their way into my daughter's life. And slowly, something inside me shifted. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was protection. Because if they were willing to go that far to control my life, what would they do next? Then, 2 weeks before everything finally happened, they contacted my ex again. Again, even after being told to stop. Even after everything. That was the moment I realized something. They weren't going to stop. Not because they didn't understand the boundary, but because they didn't believe the boundary applied to them. And suddenly, the decision became very clear. If they wouldn't stop harassing my family,
then I would give them something else to focus on. Something big. Something that would keep them busy for a very long time. So I did something I had never done before. I sat down at my computer, opened the website for the State Cannabis Regulatory Agency, and started filling out a complaint form. At first, my hands were shaking because even though I knew they deserved consequences, this was still my father. But once I started writing, the details poured out. Everything I had seen, every conversation, every instance where they casually mentioned flying with product in their luggage, every trip, every time they crossed state lines, every regulation they were probably violating. And when I finished typing it all out, I stared at the screen for a long time. One click. That's all it would take. One click, and their entire world might start to unravel. I remember thinking about my daughter, her future, her safety, the kind of people I wanted in her life. And then I thought about something else. My grandmother. She was 95 years old, and my dad and stepmom had borrowed a massive amount of money from her, a huge amount, and they still hadn't paid it back. 95 years old, and they were financially exploiting her. That was the final push. I took a deep breath and clicked submit. After that, there was nothing to do but wait. At first, nothing happened. Days passed, then weeks, and part of me started to wonder if maybe nothing would come of it. Maybe the complaint would disappear into some digital file somewhere. Maybe nobody would care. But then, one afternoon, I heard through a mutual contact that something strange was happening. Investigators had started asking questions. Questions about their facility, about transportation practices, about compliance. Now, I don't know every detail of what happened after that, but I know enough. Because once regulatory agencies start investigating something like this, they don't do it halfway. They start pulling records, flight logs, transport documentation, inventory tracking. And if something doesn't add up, they dig deeper, way deeper. And suddenly, my dad and stepmom had a brand new problem to deal with. A very big one. The most interesting part? After the investigation started, the harassment stopped. Completely. No messages, no attempts to contact my ex, no creepy stalking behavior. Nothing. It was like they had suddenly discovered something shocking. Consequences. Turns out, when you're busy dealing with regulatory agencies and potential violations, you don't have much time left to harass your daughter. And honestly, the irony of the situation still makes me shake my head. Because these were the same people who spent their entire lives preaching about rules, about morality, about respecting authority. But the moment those rules applied to them, suddenly things got complicated. For the first time in a very long time, my life became quiet, peaceful. No harassment, no manipulation, no constant fear that they were trying to worm their way back into my daughter's life. Just silence. And honestly, that silence was worth everything. Do I feel proud of what I did? That's a complicated question, because revenge isn't always as simple as it looks in movies. But I'll say this. Sometimes the only way to stop someone who refuses to respect boundaries is to make those boundaries real, with consequences. And if those consequences come from their own choices, well, that's not revenge. That's just karma catching up. If this story shocked you, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more intense Reddit revenge stories. And I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell me, did she go too far, or was this completely justified? Because stories like this remind us of something important. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who never expect us to fight back. And when we finally do, they realize something too late. Actions always have consequences, and karma has a very long memory.